1965. Okay, pretend I have a lectern right here because we're going to go do a little history lesson, okay? 1965, that's the year, the cutoff point for true vintage. Anything that's classically called a vintage guitar is pre-1965. That's Fender, that's Gibson, and that's Martin. And there's reasons for it too. So some vintage guitars go on to the 70s, but it's really about 1965. And between 1950 and 1965, a lot happened. In 1949, there was no solid body guitars. In 1949, there was only hollow body, archtop electric guitars. There were no solid body guitars. So Fender was making guitars and amplifiers, Hawaiian guitars. The country was still doing Hawaiian music. It was adopted by a lot of country musics. So forgive me, but I'm going to go back here. 1949, the only solid body electric guitars were Hawaiian. In 1950, Fender came up with this design because they got requests from bands that were playing country music in California. Audiences were getting bigger and bigger. Feedback became a problem. That was the issue. Big audiences meant bigger amps. Bigger amps meant feedback became a problem trying to reach all those people that were showing up to your gigs. The music boom was just starting. In 1951, there is a song called Rocket 88, and I'm going to bring this forward. Somebody put about $6,000 into putting inlay on this in Rocket 88. Rocket 88 was a song that was known as the first rock and roll song ever. That came out in 1951. That song lit a match. Go look it up. Rocket 88. God, I can't go through the lyrics in my head right now because I'm nervous because you guys are all watching. In 1952, Fender started making larger amps. So music started getting bigger. Rock and roll had not been termed. Muddy Waters did say the blues had a baby, and they named it rock and roll, but that came later. In 1952, Gibson introduced their first solid body, the Les Paul. Did you know that the early Les Pauls didn't have serial numbers? Because Gibson thought we would all go back to this type of guitar. They thought the whole solid body guitar thing would go on its merry way and we'd all get out of our heads and come back and play real guitars. In 1950, Gibson made 5,000 instruments a year. In 1950, they made 5,000 instruments a year. By 1965, they made 100,000 a year. The boom was coming. 1954, no longer were they making the broadcaster or the Telecaster for television. They were looking at space travel, and the Stratocaster went into the stratosphere. This was the big deal in 1954. Yet Elvis hadn't showed his head. There was a lot of R&B records coming out. Blues was coming out. But because of segregation, frankly, in the United States, those records were really not as popular as they could be. In 1955, Muddy Waters introduced Chuck Berry to Leonard Chess at Chess Records. In 1955, Chuck Berry signed a deal with him, and his first hit came out in 1956. Elvis Presley came out with Heartbreak Hotel. Boom! The top goes off. Suddenly, audiences are huge all over. Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel broke all sales records. The parents were worried. In 1956, I forget which song Chuck Berry was, Roll Over Beethoven, was a big song. We also had Fats Domino, Carl Perkins, Bill Haley and the Comets. All of this was coming out. Rock and roll, choo-choo, was going on. And all the factories that were making guitars, Fender could not keep up. By 1956, Fender had tripled the size of their factory just to keep up, making Stratocasters, Telecasters, and more importantly, amplifiers that were loud enough for all these rooms that were getting huger and huger and huger. Guitars got bigger, amplifiers got bigger, and solid body electrics were the king of the realm. Suddenly, all these factories were hiring extra people to make guitars that they thought was a joke. 1957, Elvis, and Buddy Holly. That's what was happening in 57. 1958, Johnny B. Good. There. Johnny B. Good is the most copied song. They sent Johnny B. Good out into space. And it's rumored that the aliens came back and said, send more Chuck Berry. True story. Okay, now we get into 1960. Elvis goes into the Army. Things start slowing down a little in the R&B, blues, rock thing. They had not yet quite defined it as rock and roll. We had Ray Charles in 1965, or 1962. We had Bobby V from in town here. Bobby V had Devil or Angel in 1960. Red Rubber Ball in 1961. Take Good Care of My Baby in 1961. The Night Has a Thousand Eyes in 1962. Those four songs were all top 10 hits. Bobby V introduced the Rolling Stones to America. The Stones backed up Bobby V. Our own Minnesota St. Cloud's own Bobby V. And that was the day of the crooner. 1963, the Beatles. 1965, the Beatles had Help, Rubber Soul. By 1965, this is the year we're stopping. Where's my sign? The point of this, 1965, the Beatles had Help, Rubber Soul. They had the movie Hard Day's Night that was out. They had just released Help. Things were blowing the lid off. All the factories could barely keep up. There we had, because of the Beatles, we had the Rolling Stones, and the Rolling Stones released their first record about that time. Satisfaction hit #1 in 1965. Then we had the other The bands, the Turtles, the Zombies, the Loving Spoonful. Oh, by the way, I happen to have a picture here of John Sebastian from the Loving Spoonful. John Sebastian doesn't look like the guy that might have played at Woodstock, but he was played at Woodstock. That's beyond 65, we won't get there. So in 1965, in 1950, Martin made 2,000 guitars a month. In 1965, they made 6,000. Fender doesn't really have shipping records, but their factories just kept expanding and expanding and expanding, and pretty soon by 1965 they had the Jazzmaster, the Jaguar, the Jazz Bass, the P-Bass, the Stratocaster, the Telecaster Thin Line, well not the Thin Line, but the double bound Telecaster, the Telecaster Custom, all kinds of steel guitars, amplifiers. 65, Leo Fender got sick of it all and he sold it for $13 million to a division of Columbia Records. He was tired of it. Ted McCarty, when he took over Gibson in 1950, he got off the presidency in 1965. In 1965, Martin got out of the old North Street factory and moved to the giant new Sycamore Street factory. This is why 1965 is a critical year, and you have to look at it through the lens of what happened. In 1950, there were no solid body guitars, except the Broadcaster that everyone laughed at. Then rock and roll hit quickly. By 1965, everything moved so fast, the factories got so big, many enthusiasts feel like for Fender, for Gibson, and for Martin, that's the point at which you kind of lose interest in the classics. Before then, you had Brazilian rosewood boards. You had unbelievable hand workmanship and pride before they had to hire all these new people and expand their factories. Even Martin, which was minuscule compared to Gibson, Martin only made flat top guitars and a few ukuleles. They boomed during that time period. After that, everything kind of changed. We're going to do some other videos on Fender, why Ted McCarty, who invented the 335 and arguably the Les Paul, Leo Fender, and Martin, who's always been owned by the same family. The great-great-great-great-great-grandson of the original owner still owns it. So we'll go over that soon. This is, though, my message. Vintage guitars are pre-1965, not just for Fender and CBS. That's it. Walk up, fade out on that. We'll come back to you later.